the subject of our workshop series is emerging and re-emerging energy superpowers. We have made the decision to start with Iran, which has an enormous potential.
And I'm delighted that now, as the chairman of the Interparliamentary Union in the House of Parliament, I will be welcoming the first Iranian parliamentary delegation to the United Kingdom since that period, that will be arriving in a couple of weeks' time in Parliament to begin, or at least to take a little bit further, the inevitable healing process that must go on when nations have their difficulties, but realise that we all ultimately have to live together. Much of Iran remains mysterious, partly because the Iranian government in particular is very careful in keeping a layer of mystery about it, what it may or may not be doing. And partly also because we think there is a genuine clash going on within Iran for its identity, for what Iran is going to emerge 30 odd years post the revolution. The politician dealing with Iran knows that in terms of leverage and power, Iran has got something, pretty special. It's got Professor Stern? It's got the world's largest reserves of gas and the fourth largest reserves of discovered oil. It's a major player on the energy scene, which is going to bring benefit to the world and to itself. As Friedbert was saying, all our understanding at present is that this power is far from being realised. It's not just a question of the sanctions, it's a question of the technology over years.
There has been a massive increase in gas production in Iran. It is in fact, even taking into account US shale gas production, it has increased its production at the fastest rate of any country over the past 2 decades. The problem is that in so doing it has also increased demand at, if anything, an even faster rate. The essence of the demand increase is about the subsidies in prices which have held prices down at very low levels.
I suggest even in a more optimistic scenario, you cannot, or maybe we should not expect that all sanctions will be lifted immediately. I think a more realistic scenario might be that a gradual lifting of sanctions as kind of a process where Iran needs to take, of course, some steps. In return, we may lift some of the sanctions, then waiting on further steps on the Iranian side would be probably a more realistic scenario. Even if you would assume a lifting of sanctions even immediately, there are definitely a number of regulatory, economic, financial and other factors which will lead to a situation where Iranian gas exports or increasing gas exports need certainly some time. I think most of the experts I have spoken and seen in the debates expect that larger Iranian gas exports and also oil exports will take place after approximately another 5 years. So probably not before 2020. Interestingly, the situation in the oil sector is not so optimistic as it looks like at the first glance. And that has to do that 80% of Iran's operating oil fields are already in the second half life. And that means that we have here a factor where energy efficiency, production efficiency comes into the play. And that factor, I think, in the future will definitely become a more important factor.
Two are the major forthcoming blocking factors, one of which being the international sanctions, and the second one being the oil contracts that are unfavorable to the international oil companies. And I remember that last year on the event that we had here on Iran, Professor Pflüger called for the international community to give Iran a chance. And now, almost a year later, the international sanctions and reaching the permanent agreement remains the key and foremost precondition for the development of the energy sector. But with the Iranian authorities announcing the preparation of new contracts, the so-called integrated petroleum contract, the second question also gains key significance: to what extent those contracts will be more favorable to the oil companies, and will they address the gravest shortcomings that the buyback contracts had in a satisfactory manner to the oil companies in order to attract them. And this time we can put it another way around: to what extent Iran will give a chance to the international private sector. Acknowledging that change in the legal system is a first step towards huge progress, but I would say that this is only the first step, and the substantial progress comes when there is stable implementation of the law. So in Iran, in the domestic environment in Iran, the international private sector has other difficulties and challenges, some of them stemming from the complicated political structure that creates a level of insecurity, and to the international private sector, the stable business environment is one of crucial importance.
Iran has, with only limited foreign support, more than doubled its natural gas production the past decade, which is quite an achievement, I'd say. At the same time, it's at a level of 166 BCM per year, which is substantially below the production level of countries like Russia or the United States. So there is still some way to go for Iran to play in that league. Sanctions did have a negative effect on investments and on the development of the Iranian upstream capabilities. This is especially problematic when Iran looks at Qatar and sees how Qatar has gotten support from international companies, and now there is gas moving from the Iranian side of the shared South Pars field to the Qatari side. So there are some issues that Iran is facing in this regard. And on the demand side, Iran has experienced massive demand growth in its country, related to a growth of population, to economic growth, and also to overconsumption in response to the subsidies that were also mentioned already. If sanctions go, and if all of a sudden lots of foreign capital and technology pours into Iran, and Iran possibly follows the example of Qatar in the 1990s of rapidly improving its upstream capabilities, then the situation might change, and Iran might be in a position both to supply the domestic market and export internationally. But having said that, there is some way to go, and I don't think this is something for the next 5 years or 10 years, but rather for the longer timeline.